welcome back. You're tuned into TMH Daily English News. The headlines for today: the Tigray withdraws its forces from Afar as part of the commitment to the humanitarian truce. European Commission says World Bank's approval of $300 million grant to Ethiopia is premature and potentially counterproductive. And the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict depicts harrowing pictures of the sexual violence perpetrated by the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces within the Tigray region. As we move on to our main updates for today, the Tigray government says it has withdrawn its forces from Afar as part of the commitment to this ongoing humanitarian truce. The government of Tigray, in a statement read out on Tigray TV, said it expects immediate improvements in access to aid as well. The government of Tigray also called on the international community to play its part in ensuring that this humanitarian aid in fact reaches Tigray and the services are restored. Tigray still waits for aid nearly 3 weeks after truce was agreed between warring sides in Ethiopia, and the WFP has estimated that 4.6 million people in Tigray are in fact food insecure, and that its first 650-ton aid dispatch on the 1st of April was the first of such convoy in more than 3 months and will only feed about 30,000 of them for an entire month. This is just a drop in the ocean, which only will serve a fraction of the needs, as the United Nations agency said in a response to an emailed question by Bloomberg on Tuesday. While the agency said it is prepared to continue providing assistance, it needs swift and access to fuel as well as cash. Since the start of the fighting in November of 2020, healthcare, electricity, banking, and telecommunications have all been disrupted. Ultimately, it is essential to restore basic services in the Tigray region after almost 1.5 years of interruption, as WFP notarized. Tigrayan leaders last week bemoaned the inadequacy of the aid flows and accused the government of using the cessation in hostilities to in fact intensify the siege on Tigray. On Tuesday, the government of Tigray said it was withdrawing its forces from the neighboring Afar region, and an immediate improvement in access to humanitarian assistance was expected in return. Salamawit Kasa, state minister at the Communication Ministry office, didn't immediately respond to a request for comment. The European Commission says the World Bank's approval of $300 million grant to Ethiopia is in fact premature and potentially counterproductive. The World Bank's board has approved $300 million grant for Ethiopia to support the immediate needs of people as they face devastation caused by this ongoing conflict and civil war within the country. A spokesperson for the European Commission told Devix, however, that the move is premature and potentially counterproductive to the nascent peace process, and analysts following Ethiopia also expressed concern that the grant would reward the government before it opens up full humanitarian access to the conflict-hit region of Tigray. There are plans for potentially more World Bank financing for Ethiopia this year, according to a person familiar with this issue. The European Commission, which is not a shareholder of this bank, tried to postpone the move, according to the sources familiar with the matter, arguing that more time was needed to assess the situation within the country. To us, peace is still too fragile to start financing the reconstruction in Ethiopia, the Commission spokesperson said in an email to Devix on Wednesday. In this regard, the World Bank's $300 million grant for reconstruction decided at its board meeting on the 12th of April is premature and, in context of the current political statement, just counterproductive. We are the opinion that approving this grant will send the wrong signal at a time more efforts are needed to ensure the sustainable and suitable humanitarian access to all Ethiopians and the long-lasting peace, as the spokesperson added, stressing that the Commission demanding full humanitarian access to all of the conflict areas. The EU executive is withholding budget support to Ethiopia's government, led by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, until a number of conditions are in fact met, including unfettered humanitarian access into the northern region of Tigray. The hold on support comes as the government faces a severe funding shortfall, with analysts speculating that this has put pressure on Abiy Ahmed to engage in peace process and let in some of the aid supplies to the regions that needed most. Analysts have questioned the sincerity of the government's peace process. Differences between European countries over how to respond to the conflict promoted and prompted the bloc of the Foreign Affairs Chief, Josep Borrell, to say in December that the EU inability to react properly to human rights violations in Ethiopia was one of his biggest frustrations of 2021. William Davison, a senior analyst for Ethiopia at the International Crisis Group, cautioned that approving the latest round of funding could incentivize the government to continue its piecemeal approach to peace as well, rather than fully undertaking the path to resolving this ongoing conflict. Approving the World Bank grant could show the inadequate piecemeal steps towards peace will be rewarded, and so to create an incentive to continue with that approach rather than fully reconnecting Tigray to the national economy, which is what is needed to minimize the suffering and the ongoing disaster, as Davison told Davix. There seems to be a mismatch between the more political approach from parts of donor governments that is geared towards encouraging Ethiopia's government to pursue peace and that of the development arms of those governments that approved this grant, as he added that there are additional questions around whether continued outside financial support will free up Ethiopia's government to spend more on their military needs. Political analysts on the Horn of Africa, Goitom Hebralul, reacting to the grant approval, criticized the international community for continuing to fund Ethiopia's self-destruction as well as genocide. Why would Prime Minister Abiy not use starvation as a weapon of war or waste resources on arms when it clearly has no consequence? Of course, the media will not ask these basic questions, as he wrote on his official Twitter account. The European Commission also took issue with the decision to channel funds through Ethiopian Finance Ministry. Security Council will today was requested by the 83 members of the Council to discuss the situation and the ongoing conflict within Ethiopia. Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Martin Griffiths, is expected to brief. According to the Security Council report, this is the first time that the meeting on the situation in Ethiopia has been requested solely by the A3, and it seems that today's meeting will focus on the humanitarian situation in northern Ethiopia in light of the recent developments, and the Council members are likely to stress that the current level of humanitarian access remains insufficient and may reiterate calls for unfettered access. They may also highlight the importance of the reestablishing of telecommunications, electricity, banking, and other key services and goods within Tigray. While it appears that today's meeting will focus on the humanitarian aspects, Security Council report indicated that some members may also raise the issue of relating to human rights in whole. UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict, Pramila Patten, depicts harrowing picture of sexual violence perpetrated by the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces in the Tigray region. Patten made the remark while opening on the 13th of April annual open debate on conflict-related sexual violence. She said conflict-related sexual violence is rife in areas suffering from conflict and humanitarian crisis, adding that these crimes are a daily occurrence in many countries, including Ethiopia's Tigray region, Afghanistan, the DRC, Iraq, South Sudan, Syria, and Ukraine as well. On Tigray, she mentioned serious human rights abuses and violations in international humanitarian law, including ethnically targeted sexual violence against women and girls attributed to the Eritrean and Ethiopian forces. Let's take a listen.
The report before us today surfaces painful human stories, all of which cry out for justice and redress. In northern Ethiopia, a young woman was taken to an Eritrean Defense Forces camp, where 27 soldiers raped her, as a result of which she contracted HIV. An elderly, visually impaired woman was shot by soldiers after being detained for 3 days while her daughter was raped by members of the Ethiopian National Defense Forces in an adjacent room. An adolescent boy was raped in Himora, who later committed suicide.
The lack of humanitarian access to Tigray has prevented survivors from receiving basic life-saving services, including health and psychosocial support. During the open debate, several council members referred to the situation in Ethiopia. Helena Berhanu, the first Ethiopian civil society representative to brief the Security Council since the conflict erupted, highlighted several cases of conflict-related sexual violence within Ethiopia. She said that rape has been systematically perpetrated and used as a tactic of war, and that sexual violence has been ethnically motivated and that it has been used to humiliate survivors and their communities. Among other issues, Berhanu stressed that the conflict has undermined women's rights, including access to reproductive health care as well as psychosocial support. Biden has currently referred to the Ukraine crisis as a genocide. Biden calls Russia's war in Ukraine a genocide, and Biden's initial comment came at an event in Menlo, Iowa, where he was decrying the effects of Russian President Vladimir Putin and the invasion of Ukraine on the higher prices Americans are paying for gas as well as food. Your family budget, your ability to fill up your tank, none of it should hinge on whether a dictator declares war and commits a genocide on half of a world away. Using a term his aides have been studiously avoiding, Biden adds, "It sure seems that way to me." The fact that the evidence of genocide around in Tigray, but the designation of genocide is kept in the State Department drawers, has drawn criticism from many quarters of the U.S. double standards. Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, David Satterfield, and Deputy Special Envoy Patton Nope are in Ethiopia currently for meeting with the Ethiopian government officials, representatives of the humanitarian organizations, and the diplomatic partners. And according to the U.S. Embassy in Ethiopia, their visit continued to U.S. efforts towards ceasing hostilities, unhindered humanitarian access, and transparent investigations into human rights abuses and violations by all actors, and a negotiated resolution to the conflict within the country. In other news, the top U.S. diplomat for the Horn of Africa region, David Satterfield, is leaving his post after just several months on the job. Current and formal officials familiar with the matter told Foreign Policy that Satterfield is leaving a fresh diplomatic void in a region that is confronting rising political instability, mass atrocities, and the threat of famine as whole. The Deputy Special Envoy Peyton Knopf is expected to take over his job on an interim basis in acting capacity to the two officials. Said behind the scenes, Satterfield was working almost exclusively on Ethiopia, and the congressional aide, as obviously there's going to be some questions about how to keep that sustained engagement as well as pressure. Horn of Africa analyst Rashid Abdi pointed to the dysfunction in the U.S.-led mediation. He confirmed that the U.S. Special Envoy is in fact leaving his job, quote-unquote, frustrated out by Obasanjo, AU, as well as Ethiopia. The Economist says ethnic cleansing of Tigrayans may prolong Ethiopia's current civil war. The report emphasized the urgent need for a breakthrough to ease the blockade to avert any more mass starvation. Temnit Bairu presents the story as follows.
The lucky ones were frog-marched into buses and driven across the river. The less fortunate were slung into detention camps and left there to rot. Others were murdered in the streets or hacked to death as they cowered in their homes. Thus begins a story by The Economist. We don't need a single one of them anymore. They cannot be trusted, a militiaman told a foreign researcher last year. Since the start of the Ethiopian bloody civil war 18 months ago, there have been frequent allegations of ethnic cleansing targeting people from the northern region of Ethiopia, Tigray. Anthony Blinken, America's Secretary of State, first leveled this charge more than a year ago, infuriating the government of Abiy Ahmed, which strongly denied it. Because the government has imposed a tight blockade of the region, it has been hard to assess the claims of the authorities. It has been hard to assess the claims of the atrocities. But some horrifying hints have emerged, such as the corpses with their hands bound that have washed up on riverbanks in Sudan. Now, a thorough investigation by the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, two pressure groups, leaves little doubt of the enormities committed by the government forces and their allies. The joint report, published on April 6, concludes that authorities from the Amhara region have systematically killed or evicted hundreds of thousands of ethnic Tigrayans from territory seized from Tigray since the start of the war. The campaign, carried out with the connivance of federal authorities, was as methodical as it was brutal. Notices ordering Tigrayans to leave were pinned around towns. Freshly appointed Amhara officials handed out title deeds for plots of stolen land. Identification cards were given to new Amhara arrivals, but denied to Tigrayans who were prevented from receiving aid and government services. The new authorities even granted permits for shipments of looted sesame, a lucrative cash crop at the heart of the territorial dispute between the two regions. This matters not only because of the frightful human toll. The area, known officially as Western Tigray before the war, is now arguably the biggest obstacle to ending the conflict. It's definitely the thorniest issue, says a senior official of the ruling party. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans are starving. A humanitarian truce that started on March 24th is already teetering. The government has allowed just one aid convoy to enter Tigray, the first since mid-December, and has been withholding permission for more until the Tigray forces withdraw to Tigray. The government of Tigray has done that, but unhindered flow of humanitarian aid into Tigray is yet to begin. According to The Economist, without a breakthrough to ease the blockade, the horror of ethnic cleansing will be matched by an equally grotesque abuse, deliberate mass starvation.
Thank you and welcome back. You're still tuned into TMH Daily English News. Our final update for today is a Tigrayan paleoanthropologist has become a member of the Pontifical Academy of Science. Pope Francis has appointed Zarasanay Alamsagad, an Ethiopian paleoanthropologist who discovered the oldest child, to be a member of the Pontifical Academy of Science. Zarasanay Alamsagad, who studies the origin and evolution of early human ancestors, is a professor at the University of Chicago, and his fieldwork in Ethiopia led to finding nearly complete fossilized remains of the world's oldest child. 3.3 million-year-old human ancestors belonging to the same extinct hominid species as Lucy, and the nickname of one of the most well-known human ancestor fossils. Dubbed Lucy's Child, is the most complete skeleton of a human ancestor discovered to date and represents a major advancement in understanding human evolution. The Pope also appointed Stanley B. Prusner, an American neurologist and Nobel Prize laureate in medicine, and Amicio Cuda, an Argentinian theologian, secretary of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, to the Academy as well. That concludes our news for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.